Have a seat.
Now that you're here.
That's right. Okay, welcome everyone. I'm Mark Lewis. I'm the Literary Branch Chair. This is a special event today. We appreciate you coming out, featuring our fearless leader, whom you all know, but I have an introduction anyway, and since he handed it to me personally, I'd better read it. So, Len Claife was born in 1948, grew up in Queens, New York. I think some other graduates of Bayshore High School?
Bayside High School.
Bayside. There's Carol, right? Yeah. We weirdly, there's like 6 of them. They're all within 2 years of each other in Ojai. We should have a special event for them. Right. You'll be back, and Carol will join us. Anyway, so Len went to undergrad in SUNY Buffalo, which will figure in today's story, and then he was off to get his JD at Iowa, which also will figure in the story. And then he started his career, as you will hear, defending one of the Attica defendants in the wake of the uprising. After all the things you'll hear about today, that he took a sabbatical, traveled as a stage parent with a son who was cast in the road company The King and I with Yul Brynner. Yul Brynner, by the way, used to hang around in Ojai in the 40s. He was one of those Krishnamurti guys. Worked at B. Dalton in Santa Monica. Received his massage therapist license after studying at the Institute of Psychostructural Balancing. This guy had to come to Ojai, and he did. In 1992, after getting his California bar, or passing the California bar, joined the Arts Center in 94, became president in 95, was president for many years, came back, and has been president again since 2019. And has been in 20 plays here. Most recently, he was Yertle the Turtle in Seussical the Musical. He says, and this is from Len, ran unsuccessfully for city council in Ojai 4 times, shows good sense of the Ojai citizenry. Married to Linda Harmon for 16 years, between us 5 kids and 8 grandchildren. Welcome, Lenny Claife.
Thank you. I would say it's nice to be here, but I'm pretty much always here.
And it's always nice.
But it really is nice to see all of you. Thank you all for coming out. If there's anybody watching on Facebook, welcome. And thank you for doing this, Mark.
Oh, you bet. Well, thanks for doing it with us. Anyway, so Len, why don't you put us in the picture? I think most of us are familiar, at least to some extent, with Attica, but put us in the picture as to what happened and why, and then we'll shift to you, and then we'll bring the 2 stories together.
The first thing, talking about everybody knows what happened. There was an article in the Ojai Valley News last week with my picture and a story about this afternoon. And I was in the post office, and one of the clerks said, I saw the story, and I already learned a lot, because I remember seeing the Al Pacino movie, Dog Day Afternoon, where he raises his fist and starts screaming, Attica, Attica, Attica. Now I know what he was talking about.
Well, there's many paths into history, and that's one.
I was a law student. I was just starting my senior year in Iowa when the Attica Rebellion took place. And I remember, along with millions of others watching on television, and then the state came in and shot everybody and put down the rebellion. And I in the book, Tom Wicker, who was was New York Times columnist and was one of the observers at Attica. The one part of the book that will stick with me forever is when he talks about how when the after the state took over the prison again, they announced that the guards had been killed, that their throats had been slashed by the inmates, that they'd been castrated and mutilated. And Tom Wicker said, and I believed it. And when the inmates claimed, no, that's not what happened, they were all killed by the state, I didn't believe it. And what happened was the state killed everybody. There is video that the state turned over to the defense. The one part of it that will stick with me is one of the guards up on the tower getting ready to shoot, and he's got his gun lined up, and he says, That's the ugliest nigger I've ever seen, and pulls the trigger. The state police were ordered by Governor Rockefeller after 4 days to retake the prison, and they killed 39 inmates and 10 guards. And as horrible and horrifying as that is, the torture that the 1,200 inmates had to undergo in the days that followed was even worse. They were all stripped naked. They were made to run gauntlets where the guards were lined up with their billy clubs. There was broken glass all over the yard, and they had to run through the broken glass. One of the most amazing people I met at Attica was Frank Big Black Smith, and he at the time, a lot of the inmates were taking Muslim names. He wasn't a Muslim, so he wasn't going to take a Muslim name, but he decided Frank Smith was his slave name. So he didn't want to be known as Frank Smith. He was big, and he was black. So he decided he was Big Black, and that's what he called himself, and that's what he insisted that people call him. And he was made to lie on the ground with a football under his neck, and told that if the football hit the ground, he was a dead nigger. And in the hours that followed, the police put the cigarettes out on him, beat him. It was horrifying. I don't know if that's a place to pause. You want to ask me a question?
Yeah, because we're going to. Let's pause there and circle back to this happens, and you are
I'm watching
in law
it on
school,
television.
right? So you were obviously, as a citizen, had a reaction to it, but it became a professional thing too. First of all, how did you get to Iowa? Because that's a good story.
Well, I'm the dean of the law school at Iowa at the time, and his wife and my folks met on their mutual honeymoons, and stayed friendly over the years. So when it came time for me to go to law school, I had pretty much demonstrated my way through undergraduate school, made it through in 4 years. Not the most credentialed person in the history of the State University of New York at Buffalo. But I know there was a meeting at the faculty, it was a law school, where the dean said, I've known this kid since before he's born. You can flunk him once he gets here, but he's getting in. Does anybody object? So that's how I got into the University of Iowa Law School. And I decided that I should go there to law school rather than stay in Buffalo, because I figured I really would have to study if I went to law school. And what else is there to do in Iowa except study? So that's how I got to Iowa. And I went back to Buffalo. My first wife was from Buffalo. We met when we were undergraduates there. I'd made a lot of friends and had contacts and got a job as staff counsel for the Buffalo chapter of the American Civil Liberties Union. I was the lowest paid member of my graduating class. But through contacts at the Civil Liberties Union and people that I knew in Buffalo, over the intervening, I graduated in May, studied for the bar exam for a couple of months, and started working at the Civil Liberties Union in September, and didn't get the results and get sworn in until February. So those intervening months, I was not quite a lawyer, but started hanging out with the defense.
So what attracted you to law school to begin with? I mean, activism to begin with, or just
two guys, Bruce Beyer and Bruce Klein, in 1968 took symbolic sanctuary at the Unitarian Church in Buffalo after refusing induction. According to Channel 7 Eyewitness News, they hid at the Unitarian Church on the corner of Elmwood and Ferry for 10 days until the FBI came in and arrested them and 7 other people, the Buffalo Nine, two left lawyers from the time, Jerry Lefcourt and Michael Kennedy, represented them. Michael Kennedy was about 6'6", wore the most impeccable suits, made Robert Redford look ugly, and he had this incredibly cool way of, as he'd stand up to address the court, of buttoning his suit coat. He never unbuttoned it, that you could see, but every time he'd stand up, he would button it. Jerry Lefcourt was about my height, dressed and slept in the same suit. And one day after court left court, Jerry was on the steps of the courthouse. The FBI agents had been on the stand lying all day. And Jerry said, "Pig after pig, lie after lie, I can't take it anymore." And at that point, I knew what I wanted to do with my life. So I knew what I was going to do anyway. I went to law school. I was going to be a criminal defense lawyer. I didn't envision Attica, but there was a whole lot of other political activities going on. People I knew and respected and liked and were being arrested for participating in anti-war demonstrations, civil rights stuff. So that's what I was going to do. And Attica was the perfect fit.
And your first client.
My
so
first client. Before I got sworn in, I was helping with when there was an organization known as the Attica Brothers Legal Defense. Lawyers flew in from all over the country, law students, non-legal people, to help out. We had rented several houses scattered around Buffalo where the volunteers could stay. And we'll get back to this at some point. The inmates who were being released, because they finished serving their sentences, bail that was set for the Attica cases at a very, very low level, and we bailed everybody out. And the defendants stayed in Buffalo and participated in the defense. Mm-hmm. So there was a defense organization, and I joined it and was introduced to one of the defendants, and we got along fine. And the day after I got sworn in, I appeared in court in Buffalo, and the case has been, Attica's about 60 miles from Buffalo. The courthouse was way too tiny to handle that. Where was I? Anyhow, I was introduced to one of the defendants, a young man by the name of Rudy Moore, and we hit it off. And next day I went to the judge, and everybody agreed I should represent him. Interestingly, the Attica cases were won by the defendants on two separate dates. The first date was the original arraignment date in December of 1972, 15 months after the rebellion. The state indicted 62 defendants on 43 separate counts. And it was the state's intention to get to get everybody except the people they really cared about to plead guilty and exchange for lower sentences, and they'd testify against the guys they wanted. And every defendant, and there were, among the defendants was one person who had been convicted of killing Malcolm X, and there were followers of Malcolm X among the defendants. There was one mafia guy that had killed a couple of cops, some guy from rural upstate New York, a white kid, whose mother said they told him that if he testified and cooperated, they wouldn't do anything to him, and now they got him in there with all those niggers. That was one of the defendants. And every one of the defendants at arraignment essentially said, when the judge said, "How do you plead and do you have a lawyer?" each defendant said, "Take your MF indictment and shove it up your MFA." And well, do you have a lawyer? Take your MFing lawyer and do the same thing with it. Or Bill Kunstler is my lawyer. And for those of you who don't remember the name, Bill Kunstler was probably the most famous radical lawyer of the 60s. So at that point, their plan of just appointing lawyers off the list in Buffalo who really didn't care went down a drain. The second critical date was in June of 1973. The cases had been transferred to Buffalo. They decided it was time to get this thing moving. So they scheduled 13 defendants a day, and we're going to go through all the cases, all the defendants, make sure everybody had a lawyer, and a trial date. Brought in the first defendant. We came in with motion papers stacked so high that in order to see the judge, we had to move around to the side of counsel table. And Don Jelinek, who is head of the Attica Brothers Legal Defense and spokesman in lieu of anybody else talking for all the defendants, just started talking. And we have a motion, Your Honor. And he'd talk for 20, 30 minutes, an hour. Judge would say, motion denied. He'd turn around, take a breath, and say, okay, how about this one? And he'd talk for another hour. And if he had to go to the bathroom, I'd get up and talk for a while or somebody else. And at the end of the first day, they had not finished with the first defendant.
So the old rope-a-dope defense strategy.
Exactly. And one of the reasons it worked, besides the solidarity of each of the defendants, who were being offered misdemeanor pleas at that point, just to get rid of the cases, and they all turned them down, was the Chicago 7 trial. And if you haven't seen the movie on Netflix, The Trial of Chicago 7, fabulous film. But one of the aspects of the Chicago 7 trial was the judge was Julius Hoffman, who was the nastiest, evilest, meanest, nastiest bully judge going. And that turned the Chicago 7 into this farce, because nobody would pay any attention to him. So they decided they weren't going to make the same mistake here, and they went too far the other way, and they appointed the milquetoastiest judge in the courthouse, to be the judge in charge of Attica. So he would give us an inch, and we'd take a couple of years. And so we just talked.
Now, did you have an individual strategy, or was the team deciding, and everybody was defended the same way?
If it got to trial, there certainly were trial strategies around each defendant. For example, I met the former inmate who had testified against my client and several others at the grand jury. And he told me a fascinating story, which is that he was doing his time. He was not eligible for parole for another 5 years. They sat him down in a room with a book of photographs of all the 1,200 people in the yard, and they asked the question, do you see the person who, whatever it was, and they turn the page, and then they stop turning the page and just sit there for a while, and he'd say, that one. And he'd say, good, and then they'd ask another question. When he testified at the grand jury, his wife was living in Rochester, New York. The day he testified at the grand jury, again, 5 years before he was eligible for parole, they drove his wife, when I say they, the state police, from Rochester to Warsaw, which was the county seat where Attica was located. He testified at the grand jury. The parole board was in another room, granted him parole, and they drove him and his wife back to Rochester. And he said, I did what I had to do to get out. It's a whole lot harder for them to put me back in than it is for me to get out. And if I have to testify at trial, I'll say exactly what I told you and let them try and do something about it. So we had, yes, we had strategies for each of the defendants. My client, along with several others, was charged with possession of prison contraband, and to wit, a sawed-off shotgun. And the sawed-off shotgun was too long to be a sawed-off shotgun. It didn't meet the statutory requirements. And I read every page of the prison rules and regulations, and there was nothing prohibiting an inmate from possessing a sawed-off shotgun, nor was there any general prohibition on weapons possession. They listed lots of specific weapons, but not a general catch-all. So I was ready for trial, and that's how it went for each of the defendants.
At this point, had the state given up on they murdered the guards? None of that. That was not a charge.
No, there was one guard who died early on.
Oh, and two or three inmates too.
And two inmates were charged with killing him. They did go to trial. One of them was convicted of murder, and the other was convicted of attempted assault on that guard.
So that was a separate.
Well, it was part of it. I mean, it was part of it, and they did try a couple of the cases, but they did it without the cooperation of any of the people they were really hoping to testify, which were the other defendants. And then at the end of the first day, I got arrested.
How did that come about?
Well, what happened was when they were still working on the first defendant, and the judge was getting tired. So he said, okay, we'll finish this up in the morning, court adjourned, and they took the inmate out, and on the right side of the courtroom in front was a door that led to a little holding room and a holding cell and an elevator that went down to the basement for the underground passage to the jail, which was across the street. And as soon as this particular defendant was taken out of the courtroom, he started screaming. They're beating me, they're beating me, they're beating me. And Don Jelinek, who is the legal coordinator, goes running out after him, and I get up and I start talking. Court reporter was still there. So let the record show, and I just started describing whatever was going on. And after about 10 or 15 minutes, they came back in with the inmate, and Jelinek was screaming that they beat him up. We want a hearing. And the judge looked around and just said, court adjourned, got up and left. With the guards all, the sheriff's deputies all sort of, restraining themselves from taking out their clubs and clearing the courtroom. And we wound up negotiating that we could have 30 minutes to talk to the inmate and calm him down and let everybody cool off. Otherwise, there's going to be a problem. And after about 15 minutes into that 30 minutes, one of the deputies, who I knew, and was a nice guy, grabs me and says, come on, Leonard, getting you out of here. And I said, we got 30 minutes. And he said, come on with me. I just don't want you to get in trouble. So he brought me out into this little anteroom. And I'm sitting there, and I don't know, 30 minutes later, the chief courtroom deputy comes in. And I said, can I leave? And he says, yeah. And I get up and start to leave. And one of the other deputies says, no, he can't leave. The chief, referring to Joseph Tutlemundo, who is the head narc in Erie County, the chief arrested him. So the shrugs. And we never could figure out why the chief arrested me, because when I went to trial, he didn't testify. But I sat in the cell for a while. They took my tie, they took my belt, and I hung out in that little cell for, I don't know, an hour or two, I guess, until one of the lawyers found the judge to sign a piece of paper releasing me.
What was the charge?
Obstructing governmental administration or some such thing. I really don't remember. But the other interesting tidbit on that, my client, my individual client, who was out at that point, he was out on bail, had been thrown out of the courtroom earlier in the day because he was wearing his Muslim skull cap. And it took, that was the first day that they decided they weren't going to allow people to wear religious caps in the courtroom. We got that changed within a day or two. But he heard, so he's out in the hallway, and he learned that I got arrested. So he got arrested trying to break into the courtroom to find out what happened to me. And the next morning, we're all in court to be arraigned. And the arraignment judge that morning was very old and very deaf, and on his last legs as a judge. And he had recognized, and they called me, and I don't think he recognized my name. But when I came up as the defendant with my lawyer, it was like he couldn't figure out what was going on. And then the next case they called was my client's, and I moved over. And the judge was really confused, and he just released everybody without bail because he couldn't figure out what was going on.
So this was the first day of your career in court as a lawyer?
Well, no, because that was 4 months later. I'd been sworn in February, and this wasn't until June that I got arrested.
So that's like 48 years ago. Have you had an equally exciting day in court ever since?
That's the only time I was ever arrested in court. I probably have had as interesting days. If I think about it, I could tell some stories, but it's not about Attica.
No. Just checking.
Yeah. So we flew to Dean at a law school. This is a little aside. We flew to Dean at a law school in Iowa out to testify at my trial as a character witness. Because I'd known him forever, and he was the dean when I was there. And so we called him as a witness, and my lawyer questioned him, and the dean was talking about, basically I was a pain in the ass, but I knew where the line was. I knew how far I could go. And then the DA gets up to cross-examine him. And first question was, would you say Mr. Clay is, and he wanted to say communist or radical or something, bad. And the best the guy could come up with, would you say he's an idealist? And the dean was a very cool-looking guy, big shock of white hair, big bushy eyebrows, red socks that he only wore red socks. And he sits back in the chair and ponders for a minute and says, yeah, I'd say so. But he's only 25. It would be kind of sad if he wasn't. Which still is one of the great answers that I've ever heard in the courtroom.
And you, in fact, were...
I was acquitted.
Justice was done.
It was really a dopey trial because nobody knew what I had done, And the guy who allegedly ordered my arrest, who was later convicted of taking bribes and sent to prison, never showed up. It was odd. It was odd. So
ultimately what was the end of the case, all the cases?
So anyhow, we basically just kept filing motions, and we'd file appeals. They did get to try a couple of the cases, as I said, and then in 1975, Hugh Carey, who was a Democrat, was elected as governor. Rockefeller had been a Republican, of course. And he appointed a commission, and the commission concluded that everything we were claiming about the unfairness of the prosecution was accurate. That the grand jury who indicted the defendants was comprised of neighbors and friends and an occasional cousin of the guards at Attica. That the guards had committed horrendous crimes, and none of them were charged. And the governor granted pardons to all the defendants, ending the cases that didn't go to trial. That was the end of that. And he pardoned the two people who had been convicted. Governor Carey, Hugh Carey. And he really didn't have any choice, because the grand jury was a joke. The grand jury was comprised literally of friends, neighbors, and relatives of the guards, and that ended part one of Attica, and there was a part two of Attica, which was civil litigation that I really didn't have anything to do with. It's about a 10-page article written by Joe Heath, who was one of the attorneys who participated both in the criminal defense and the civil action that followed. And the inmates sued the guards, the state of New York, for what had happened to them afterwards. And it took until the year 2000, and the state settled for $12 million to the inmates. Frank Smith got to buy his little farm in North Carolina, where he retired and lived out his days. and the inmates got some money.
Well, you told me when we were talking about this before the recidivism rate. What was how did it go with their inmates afterwards?
It was one of the more. If I ever went and got back to school and got a degree in sociology or something, I would write my thesis on following the Attica defendants after Attica was over. My particular client was institutionalized for the first time when he was 6. He was sent to a Dominican nun's home after his mother held his hand over and opened fire. And from there, he went out to the streets and hit people over the head and robbed them and did this and did that. And every time he'd be released, he'd go back to the exact same environment, which was the same for each of the defendants. This time when they were released, instead of going back to where they normally go back to, they all stayed in Buffalo. And as I said, we had houses where they lived with the volunteers and lawyers who came in from all over. They participated in defense strategy meetings. They spoke at churches and civic groups. And my client got a job with the city of Syracuse as a housing inspector, and later with, I think it was Gulf or one of those other gas oil companies as a campus representative. Big Black was an investigator for lawyers in New York, and I knew a couple of the people who stayed in Buffalo and stayed out of trouble. I think that if you follow the life of the Attica defendants after Attica, it would be absolutely the best example you could come up with about why we should have more money spent on real rehabilitation work, on really, not having each parole officer or probation officer have 200 clients, but have 20. And it would certainly be expensive, but cheaper than incarcerating all these people on a variety of levels. And speaking of cheaper, at the time of Attica, at the time of the riot, inmates were allotted one roll of toilet paper per month, one shower per week, and the state spent 96 cents a day for food for each inmate. The prison was overcrowded, and prison overcrowding then was nothing compared to prison overcrowding now. I mean, this was before gangs and before the war on drugs. And California is still under a federal court. I'm trying to referee, a guardian appointed by a federal court judge because of overcrowding, because of lack of food, because of lack of medical care, lack of psychiatric care. Since Attica, we've closed all the mental hospitals, and we put people who should be in mental hospitals in prison. And the trend has gone back a little bit in California, which was just horrendous. But it's still, Attica could be anywhere. The next Attica could be tomorrow at any prison anywhere in America. We don't treat the overwhelming majority of defendants as if they were human beings. Go into any courtroom, and I tried cases for 10 years. And it was my belief then, and it is my belief now, that if you have a halfway decent lawyer who cares and is not overwhelmed with too many cases, the system works. That jurors really want to do the right thing. But I could never work as a public defender because I don't know how I would live with myself
having 200 clients whose cases I was supposed to know about, and whose defense I was supposed to prepare, and whose opening and closing arguments I was supposed to put together. I couldn't do it. And the other part of the thing about Attica that stays in my head is what we showed is that if the defendants don't cooperate, the system collapses. And that's true today, and why, at some point in some county in the United States, the inmates are going to figure that out, and all of them are going to say, I want a trial. And they'll try some of them, but I don't know what they're going to do with everybody else, because there's 12 courtrooms and 500 people in jail waiting for trial. You can't try them all. So the system depends on the cooperation of the inmates. Strange system.
Speaking of the system, though, it's interesting if you think about it. Strange also, I suppose. Attica's 50 years ago, obviously, exactly, last month. I was saying Attica was 50 years ago, last month, exactly. 50 years in 1 month. And I was in high school at the time, but I remember it was apart from an outrage and a tragedy and all that, it was a scandal. It was considered a horrible thing, and that something was going to come of this. And eventually, of course, the particular prisoners were belatedly justice of some sort was done, and that they were not sent back to prison for the part and so forth, and eventually got some money. But again, my last memory of Attica, I suppose, before it drifted off into the past, was, terrible thing happened, and it was an outrage, and people, there was a sense that we would do something about it, and some sort of things were done about it. But meanwhile, after you wake up 50 years later, the whole mass incarceration thing happened after, not before, after. And now we're in a situation where it is in the forefront of, or certainly near the forefront of politics. And how did that happen after Attica? You touched a little before about the war on drugs.
Gangs and the war on drugs is what did it, and again, the war on drugs, whether intentionally or not, I don't know. It was a war on people of color. There are poor, mostly poor white people. I went to law school in Iowa, worked in the legal aid office, and as part of the legal aid work, went to the Iowa State Men's Reformatory once a month to help the inmates out on any civil legal things they had. We didn't do criminal defense. We didn't represent them on the charges. But if they were being sued for divorce, we'd help them out. If they had a medical problem, we'd try and help them out. And being Iowa, the majority of the inmates were white. It was still disproportionate to the population, people of color, but mostly white people. Everybody there was poor. And so the war on drugs was a war on poor people and people of color. And just like the closing of the mental hospitals, and the use of jails and prisons to incarcerate the mentally ill, the war on drugs is essentially a horrifying comment on the failure of society to deal in a civilized, sane, rational way with the serious problem. And beyond that, I got no magical answer. We just don't. There are enough of us who are, relatively speaking, privileged, who really don't care. It's not our problem. It's not our kids going to prison for 30 years for possession of small and for. I had a guy who was sentenced to 25 to life under the 3 strikes law for a a piece of rock cocaine that was 0.03 grams, a pebble. How does that? I mean, how do I answer the question? Why has that happened when there is no rational answer? It happened because people write laws in part, and in part, the three strikes law came about because of one horrible case. And I don't remember the people's name anymore, but there was a family who lost a family member to some guy who'd been convicted multiple times and got out and killed the polycloths. And in response to that one case, they passed the three strikes law, which is if you're convicted twice, you get convicted of a third felony, you go away for 25 to life. And they were putting people in prison for 25 to life for shoplifting a $10 pair of shoes. The famous case out of Venice, guy took a piece of pizza and didn't pay for it. My guy with his pebble of rock cocaine. And after Ojai was acquitted, there was a big movement that luckily didn't succeed. They were, everybody perceived that as the wrong verdict. And it may well have been in terms of it looks pretty clear that Ojai killed her. And to me, it looked pretty clear that the prosecution when talk about injustice, that the two prosecutors, and what was her name? Marsha Clark. And there was another guy, how they became rich and famous for losing the slam dunk case of the century. It still floors me. So, probably Ojai did it, and if they were more competent prosecutors and Ojai didn't have $29 million to put together the best defense team since Attica, he probably would have been convicted. But there were people talking about doing away with unanimous juries after Ojai, and rewriting the laws to fit the injustice of that particular case. And that's always dangerous. And that's how we react. And it took, 20 years after polycloths, where they finally reformed the three strikes law to some extent and required that the present felony be what's considered a serious or violent felony, which is way too inclusive of a class anyway, but doesn't include shoplifting and possession of small amount of drugs. And lots of people who were doing 25 to life were released from prison. Well, again, you have to have two. God, now let me think for a second. The two prior felony convictions have to be listed in the list of serious felonies and violent felonies. There are two separate lists in the penal code. The following are serious felonies, the following are violent felonies. The two priors have to be in either of those classes. The third felony now must also be in that class. So if your present felony is not a serious or violent felony, they just double the sentence as opposed to getting the 25 to life. But again, it took my guy with the drugs spent 15 years in prison under the three strikes law with that silly amount of crack cocaine. I mean, how many Wall Street brokers got convicted of possession of cocaine? One maybe. And it just is the way it is, and why it is because, that's America, that's part of America, Yeah. That's an interesting question. What was Nelson Rockefeller thinking? Tom Wicker talks about that a lot in his book, A Time to Die. And Wicker asks, nobody was being threatened, nobody was being hurt. Eventually, the inmates probably would have just given up. They would have negotiated some settlement. Nobody knows. He was asked some questions about it at the confirmation hearings when he was named vice president by Gerald Ford after Nixon left, and he basically didn't answer. My guess is that the people who were running the prisons were pressuring him. You got to end it. You got to end it. You got to end it so it doesn't happen again. Otherwise, some other prison's going to go up, and that's the best answer. Why there was no supervision of the takeover? Why there was nobody there to prevent torture that took place of everybody else is another, perhaps even more damning question. I can in my head come up with, all right, we have to establish order here in the prison. We can't let this go on forever. We have to take it back. That doesn't sound foolish to me. It may not have been the right decision. There clearly were other decisions, but it doesn't strike me as foolish. That there was nobody there to prevent the torture that took place afterwards is a bigger question. And I don't know that anybody's ever asked Rockefeller that.
Too late.
Yeah.
Since this is a literary press, we'll get right back to you. It's interesting. The books still come out, and I just read about one that I think recently came out, probably timed to the 50th. It was by the son of Sam Melville, and Melville was this like weatherman adjacent guy. I don't think he was into weathermen, but he was setting bombs off in New York City. And he got arrested and sent him to Sing Sing, and he organizes a prison strike or something. And they said he was a 60s radical type and a white guy. And he winds up in Attica, and he was one of the apparently involved in the starting it, but
he was one of the leaders of Attica, and he was assassinated.
Killed in the wake of the guards, so it didn't take him to surrender.
Yeah, he was assassinated. Yeah. There were a couple of inmates who were leaders who they did not indict because they didn't want them anywhere near the courtroom. They were just the people that emerged as leaders after the rebellion were not necessarily the leaders before the rebellion, and there were a couple of guys who were too articulate. They just didn't want them in the courtroom. Jerry Rosenberg was one of them. He was the best jailhouse lawyer in the history of New York State. He'd file. He was so good that the federal judges, some of them would order the prison to allow him to come to court with his client, who was another inmate. I mean, he was good, and they didn't want him anywhere near the courtroom. L.D. Barkley was another inmate leader who they didn't want anywhere near. And Melville, they killed.
But Barkley too, right? Wasn't it?
No, he didn't kill.
Oh, was one of them the main spokesman?
Yeah.
Wasn't he killed? Somebody who only had a couple of days left in his sentence before the riot went on.
I'm not sure. Yeah, I actually was at a privately run prison in California on 9/11. I woke up in the morning to go to the prison. I was in someplace in New York State in California where they made a movie about a track team with Kevin Costner, and I can't think of it. See me? No. This is in the middle of nowhere, California. There's a private prison. That's, I mean, warehousing people to make a profit is not a system designed to make sure that the people in the prison are treated fairly. I mean, it just is it's like, the privatization of the prisons, the privatization of our army, really. I mean, we had more contractors in the Middle East than we got soldiers. You just pay them enough money, they can do whatever they want, and we don't know nothing. To answer your question, my experience is limited. They've done away with it in California, which is a good thing.
Anybody have any more questions? If not, well, Cam and
Attica is still a prison, yes, sir. No.
Cam?
The question, what were the grievances that were the cause of the uprising? In some way, the question can't be answered because the uprising itself was a spontaneous event caused by the failure of one of the locks that separated the different parts of the prison malfunctioned, and all of a sudden all the inmates were at a certain time just all rushed D yard, and they couldn't stop them because they couldn't lock the gates. But the main complaints about that the inmates raised once they were there were food, medical care, showers, toilet paper. As I said before, one roll of toilet paper a month. So I remember the first time I went to a prison was in Iowa, and my first thought was George Raft film. It looked like a movie from the 30s. There's been huge prison construction in the 70s, 80s, 90s because of the war on drugs and the gang stuff. But before that, most of the prisons had been built in the teens, 20s, and 30s, 1900s. And they all look like George Raft movies. And
20,000 years in Sing Sing.
And they're horribly frightening places. Every time I leave a prison, it's like, thank you. It's not human. It's not human what we do to people. It's horrifying. Or maybe it's too human.
Yeah, all too human.
Same side of the coin.
Well, by the way, Lenny has some handouts. He mentioned the article. Anyone? Come on up afterwards.
I've got a copy of A Time to Die, Time Wicker's book, and a graphic novel written by Frank Big Black Smith, who's one of the defendants.
So, anyway, everyone, thanks for coming, and thank you, Len.
Thank you for being here. Appreciate it. Thank you at home if anybody's at home watching.
That's right.
And thank you, Steve Adams.
And thanks, Steve Adams. Absolutely.
Technical stuff.